Welcome back to Savannah's Own, the story of the Irish Jasper Greens. I'm Patrick Collins.
And I'm Thomas Keegan.
In our last episodes, we watched a group of ambitious Irish immigrants turn social insecurity into a militia company, the Irish Jasper Greens. Then, we followed them to Mexico and back, where they returned as veterans, carrying the weight of service and the glow of public honor. In this episode, we step into the decade between wars, the 1850s, a time without major campaigns for the Jaspers, but a period that would prove just as important. This is when they truly settled into their role as a pillar of Savannah's civic life, and when the Irish community's place in the city was most visibly reshaped. Savannah in 1850 was a city in motion. Ships crowded the wharves along the river, their masts forming a jagged forest against the sky. Cotton, the great white fiber of the South, flowed constantly, from inland plantations down rough wagon roads, onto rail cars, and finally into the holds of ocean-going vessels bound for Liverpool, New York, and beyond. On Factor's Walk, merchants watched prices rise and fall. In the markets, cries of vendors mixed with the clatter of wheels and the rhythm of hammers striking metal. At the edge of all this industry, new arrivals stepped off boats with little more than a bundle and a name. Among them were thousands of Irish immigrants. Some had been in the city since the 1830s. Others had just survived the famine and its aftermath. They came with hunger, hope, and a desperate need for stability. For many of these new arrivals, the Irish Jasper Greens were more than a military company. They were a visible promise that Irishmen could rise, that they could stand uniformed, respected, and central to Savannah's life. At the heart of this transformation stood a room over a bar. The Jaspers drill room above Mr. Davidson's bar room on Drayton Street was not some marble-clad armory. It was a practical, well-used space, but to the men who climbed those stairs in the evenings, it might as well have been a kind of chapel.
Picture it. Oil lamps hanging from the ceiling, casting flickering light on wooden floorboards worn smooth by countless boots. Musket racks lined the walls, cartridge boxes and belts neatly stored. The air smelled of oil, old tobacco, sweat, and wood. Night after night, they drilled there. Veterans from Mexico standing shoulder to shoulder with boys just off the docks. Commands rang out. "Attention, company! Right face! Forward! March!" Boots struck in rhythm. Rifles snapped to shoulders. The men worked to sharpen their movements until the whole company turned and halted as if driven by a single will. And when drill ended, the room changed. The severity softened into camaraderie. The men wiped sweat from their brows, leaned rifles in their racks, loosened their collars, and gathered in small groups to trade stories. You can almost hear it in your mind. One man recalling long nights on the Rio Grande, another talking about his first day in Savannah, a third joking about how fine we'll look on the next parade when the ladies see these coats.
Below them, in the bar room, the clink of glasses and the murmur of conversation rose up through the floor. Above, in the drill room, another kind of bond was forming. The bond of men shaping a shared identity. It wasn't just about being Irish. It was about being Irish in Savannah, and being seen, at last, as part of the city.
If you wanted to understand the public importance of the Jaspers in the 1850s, you wouldn't look first at a battlefield, you'd look at a parade.
St. Patrick's Day in Savannah was already a major event, but as the decade wore on, the Irish Jasper Greens became its shining center. Imagine the streets lined with citizens, the city decked out in green ribbons and banners, church bells ringing, children perched on barrels and steps to get a better view.
And then the sound, drums beating time, fifes shrilling, boots striking in unison. Down the street came the Jaspers, uniforms crisp, brass shining, blue coats, green stripes on the trousers, plumes nodding on shakos or caps, the silk flag stitched with care rippling above them.
For the Irish in the crowd, some of whom lived in cramped quarters and worked punishing jobs, this was a moment of pure pride. Their countrymen, in full uniform, leading the celebration, recognized by the city, returning salutes from other companies and officials. It wasn't only on St. Patrick's Day. The Jaspers marched on Washington's birthday, on Independence Day, at gubernatorial visits, and at local elections. When dignitaries came to Savannah, the militia formed honor guards, and among them, steadily and unmistakably, stood the Irish Jasper Greens.
A visitor to the city in the 1850s might not know every company's name, but they could not miss the blue and green uniforms or fail to notice how the crowd responded when the Jaspers passed.
Then there were the balls. In the 19th century, military balls were as important to social life as any political meeting or church gathering. They were places where alliances were formed, marriages considered, and reputations cemented. When the Irish Jasper Greens hosted a ball, it meant something. It meant they had the clout, the funds, and the respect to draw the city's attention.
Picture an evening at a Jasper ball. The drill room or rented hall transformed, floors swept and waxed, windows cleaned, flags and bunting hung along the walls, musicians tuning violins and polishing brass instruments, candlelight or gaslight gleaming off sword hilts and uniform buttons.
Women in carefully chosen dresses arrived on the arms of fathers, brothers, or suitors. Men in uniform or evening coats bowed and greeted them. Names were announced. Polkas and waltzes filled the air.
As the night went on, you'd see Irish laborers dancing alongside clerks, artisans, and occasionally members of Savannah's older families. Whatever tension might have existed on the street or in the workplace was softened, if only for an evening, by the rituals of society.
For the Jaspers, hosting such a ball was more than a party. It was proof that they had firmly crossed a threshold, from a hopeful immigrant militia company to a respected part of the city's social fabric. The message was clear. The Irish do not merely live here. The Irish belong here. As the 1850s progressed, a noticeable change took place within the company. The faces in the ranks began to shift.
Many of the men who had marched to Mexico were now a little older, some married, some running businesses or supervising work crews. In their place, younger Irishmen stepped into the line, men who had never seen the old country, or who had been too young to remember it clearly.
For these new recruits, the Irish Jasper Greens were not just a bold social experiment. They were an established institution, a thing that had always been there, as far as they were concerned. These younger men learned the company's history as a kind of catechism, how it was founded in 1842, how it took the name of Sergeant Jasper, how it was chosen in the exchange long room, how it had gone to Mexico, how it had returned to cheering crowds.
They listened to veterans speak of disease and boredom, of cramped transport boats and the persistent hum of insects at night. They heard stories of the near fight with the Kennesaw Rangers, of riverside camps, and of the pride they felt when Savannah welcomed them home.
And in absorbing those stories, they absorbed something else, a sense of responsibility. The legacy of the Jaspers was now theirs to carry.
Leadership, too, evolved during this decade. The early need for non-Irish officers, men like Ward and Jackson, had faded. By the 1850s, the Jaspers command structure was thoroughly Irish. Captains and lieutenants now bore names that echoed the parish rolls of Ireland.
Yet their identity was layered. They were proudly Irish, yes, but they were also emphatically Savannah men and Georgians, and after Mexico, They were Americans who had already worn their country's uniform in foreign lands. That layered identity mattered. It allowed them to stand as a bridge. When tensions rose between nativists and immigrants, the Jaspers were living proof that Irish Catholics could be disciplined, loyal, and integral to civic life. When new arrivals struggled to find their footing, the Jaspers offered an example of how to balance heritage and assimilation. Keep the harp, but stand under the eagle, too.
Yet as strong as the Jaspers stood in the 1850s, they could not escape the growing shadows on the horizon.
The decade was not only a time of parades and balls, it was also the age of intensifying national conflict. Debates over the extension of slavery into new territories, the balance of power between free and slave states, and the rights of states themselves grew sharper year by year.
Newspapers in Savannah carried fiery editorials. Political speeches became more heated. People began to talk less about if and more about when conflict might break out.
The Irish Jasper Greens, like all militia companies, watched this with a mixture of concern and readiness. Their drills, once largely ceremonial, acquired a new edge. Their rifles were cleaned a little more carefully. Officers quietly discussed the company's readiness for active service. Some Irishmen, especially recent immigrants, had complicated feelings. Many had fled oppression and hardship in Europe. The prospect of fighting in a sectional conflict over slavery and union was not simple. But as residents of Savannah and members of a proud local company, they understood that if war came, they would be expected to stand with their city and state.
Conversations in the drill room began to turn, now and then, from stories of Mexico to speculation about the future. If it comes to war, where do you think we'll be sent? What flag will we be carrying? Will the company be ready?
The 1850s were still a time of peace for the Jaspers, but it was a peace increasingly colored by anticipation. By the end of the decade, the Irish Jasper Greens were at their height.
They had a steady drill routine, strong leadership drawn from within their own community, a respected place at the center of civic ceremonies, a reputation as veterans, not just volunteers.
Young Irishmen vied for the chance to join. Older men took pride in watching them drill. The company's very existence reassured many that whatever might come, Savannah had men ready to answer the call.
And yet, if you could stand in that drill room in, say, 1859 and look into their ranks, some faces earnest, some confident, some still carrying the haunted look of famine years, you would know something they did not.
You would know that within just a few years, these same men would be called to a far greater conflict than the one in Mexico. You would know that the choices made in the exchange long room and on the Rio Grande were only the beginning. You would know that the Irish Jasper Greens, born from the desire for recognition, would soon be tested in a war that threatened to tear their nation apart. The 1850s gave the Irish Jasper Greens time to grow into themselves, to become not just petitioners for respect, but keepers of a tradition. They marched, they danced, they mourned, they celebrated. They did what communities everywhere long to do in years of relative peace. They built a life.
But peace in their case was not permanent. In our next episode, we'll follow the Jaspers into the fateful years of 1860 and 1861, through the turmoil of secession, the occupation of Fort Pulaski, and the transformation of a civic militia company into a Confederate fighting unit.
We'll explore how Irish immigrants in Savannah navigated loyalty, identity, and survival as the United States fractured. What does it mean to be Irish, American, Georgian, and Catholic when the country itself is coming apart? Join us next time for Episode 4, Fort Pulaski and the Coming Storm.